Now,
Hi, this is George Gruhn talking to you from Gruhn Guitars today. And we are well set with lots of good questions. But before even starting that, I'd like to mention that while we have been open for the past 6 weeks or so with a crew to answer email, telephone, and handle online orders as well as appraisals, starting this coming Monday, we will be open for in-person appointment visits. Not ready to throw the doors wide open toward mass crowds, but if someone is interested in visiting in person to meet with a salesperson on our staff or me personally, we will be able to accommodate some visitors. So that's just a matter of calling the shop or emailing, and we'll arrange for a visit. I'll just plow right into questions from our viewers. Tom Riley, Sydney, Australia, where he says he happily gets out of bed at 3 a.m. to listen to my thoughts every morning, which for him is Saturday after the international dateline. His question, do you have any views on the vintage amplifier market? I just turned off my wonderful 1966 Fender Princeton Reverb amp and wonder how it can be worth so little compared to some of my guitar collection. Well, for one thing, 1966 is a CBS period amp. It would not be worth as much as the pre-CBS, but the fact is the old Fender tube amps are very good. But amps in general don't last or age as gracefully as guitars do. An electric or an acoustic guitar with proper care can last an extremely long time. We have Martin guitars from the 1830s and 40s that are still playable. And Stradivari died in 1737, as I've said before on previous weeks, and people still play Stradivari violins. They've had some maintenance over the years, but they still play. Amplifiers have issues such as capacitors and other components that dry out and basically decompose, and paper speaker cones that just simply don't last forever. I remember very well how great some of those Fender amps sounded 50 years ago, because I'm 74 and a half myself now. And while I can't say that tonal memory is absolutely perfect, I do remember things like in 1967 comparing brand new Fender Tellys and Strats to 63 and 64 models and being amazed just how totally different they sounded. They don't get better simply by being old. They are better because they were built better on day one. But in the case of amplifiers, speaker cones do get brittle, and paper cones don't last the way wood does. And amps, when they're as old as some of the pre-CBS models, do tend to need work. And if you crank them up at the same volume that we did back in the 60s, you're likely to blow the speaker cone real easily, more so than it would have back then when it was newer. But in general, the guitars bring much more money in the vintage market than amps do, but there are still certain amps, things like a high-power Fender Twin, that can push serious money, but typically not the price bracket of vintage guitars. John Watson had a question about his Martin D45, which apparently was a prototype for the D45 Brazilian. And I checked with former Martin historian and customer relations person Dick Boak at Martin. And he did confirm that there were a few made, like yours, that had the model name and no serial number, and that would have been a unusual but not unheard of thing for Martin to do on a prototype at the time that your guitar was made. So last week when I answered that online, I wasn't sure. I was somewhat skeptical, but I have confirmed that yes, what you have appears to be correct. Scott in Los Angeles, can you please talk about the comparison and differences between Martin and Gibson ukuleles? They seem like opposites in many ways. Well, I think that if there's anything that's opposite about them, it's that the Martin ukes are built featherweight light, very much like Hawaiian-made ukes, though some of the Hawaiian ukes were even more light construction than Martin, but they don't hold up as well. And the Gibson ukes tended to be built more along guitar-like lines, particularly their tenor uke, the early TU model tenor uke that was made in the early 30s, was built very much just like a small guitar. So some of those Gibson ukes, being heavier construction, don't have quite the bounce of their tone, not the volume or the real uke feel that you can get out of the Martin or the Hawaiian ukes. John Bruns in Jacksonville, Florida, I'd love your advice on purchasing a vintage Urich Jazzmaster, year, color, condition. Well, condition, if you're a collector, you want the cleanest one you can possibly find. If you're a musician who just wants one as a utility guitar, you can spend a whole lot less money and still get a true golden era vintage instrument, pre-CBS Fender, if it's got a goodly bit of finish wear, and if it's been refretted very professionally so the job is great and it plays great, you'll have something that may cost you less than half as much as trying to find the same year model as a pristine vintage example. But if you're a true collector, you're going to probably want pre-CBS and pristine as possible. And so far as custom colors, that's a matter of personal preference, but keep in mind that custom color examples do not play or sound one iota different than a standard Sunburst. If you're going to pay extra for the custom color, you should at least know that you're doing it because of its collector's item appeal rather than any difference in sound. But pre-CBS, for me, is where it's at. If you're looking at a Jazzmaster, the most desirable ones will be the very earliest ones that have the thick slab rosewood fingerboard. And that means a Jazzmaster from 58 into 61 or early 62. But again, if you're a player, basically just pick something that sounds good and feels good, and you don't have to spend the collectible price. Jay Dugan, question, he recently acquired a flat top dreadnought style guitar with a national nameplate on the headstock. The body is shaped exactly like a Gibson J45. Serial number is V11612. Previous owner told me it's a 1946, but I can't find any additional information on it online or any books. Well, in 1947, National, which was Valco Company, was owned by CMI, Chicago Musical Instrument Company, which also owned Gibson. And they had some of the National acoustic flat top models and some archtop electric models with bodies made by Gibson with National necks on them. But earliest on, there were some in the dreadnought size, the model N66 introduced in 47, that actually had Gibson-made neck and body with a standard Gibson dovetail joint, although within a few years they were national necks stuck on Gibson bodies. But the earliest ones do have a glue-in neck, and the later ones have a bolt-on neck with a plastic imitation heel shape that covers bolts and a neck angle adjustment. The serial number you gave is from 1948, so it is an early example. And these guitars, the ones with the glue-in neck, sound and play fully as well as a Gibson of the same age. They're really quite equivalent to a J45. The ones with the bolt-on neck later have national finish, national made bridge, and national made neck, and the earlier ones, they have a Gibson-made neck and a Gibson-made bridge, and the finish looks like it was probably also applied at Gibson, whereas the later ones, the finish was applied at Valco. So even though it was a Gibson body, it was highly modified after the fact with non-Gibson finish and other hardware. At any rate, the early ones are very good. The later ones are pretty darn good, but not as good, and don't have the value of the earlier ones. Donald Mills, our trees are a renewable resource, but the supply has to be dwindling with an ever-growing demand for quality wood, burgeoning world population, the conversion of global forests to cropland, and laws prohibiting the import of many species into the USA. What is your perspective on this? It is true that while wood is a renewable resource, forests are rapidly disappearing, at least in the terms of being virgin forest. And tree farm wood more and more is becoming a reality in the building industry for construction lumber. And for guitars, it is certainly becoming a less readily available resource as time goes by. There is a shortage of fine mahogany. Adirondack spruce is not available in quantity enough for mass production. And guitar manufacturers are indeed making more guitars than ever before. But I don't anticipate wood simply being replaced with synthetics anytime soon. But the fact is, if you look at fine growth spruce and cedar with 25 or more grain lines to the inch, that's certainly not tree farm wood, because tree farm wood will often have 3 or 4 grain lines to the inch, and it grows a lot quicker. It's fertilized and it's spread out where it gets lots of light, but it grows fast. It's not as dense per cubic foot for the same species as wood grown in a virgin forest. And if it has 25 grain lines to the inch, that does mean that 1 inch took 25 years to grow. So if you have a guitar that is 16 inches wide with book match top, that's 8 inches on each side, you have to have a little extra to cut the wood and size it up properly. You're talking about hundreds of years to grow such a tree. We can cut it down or clear land for agriculture a whole lot quicker than that stuff grows. So we are looking constantly at alternative wood, alternative sources, but tropical rainforests in general are endangered. In many areas of the world, at the rate they're cutting and burning land just to clear it for agriculture, in 20 years or less, there may be no tropical forests in many of those areas. So where it's going to go from here, I cannot say, other than that it is in danger. And 20 years from now, certainly 50 years from now, supplies of this type wood will be very precious. Ron Ron, question, been impressed with the quality that Godin is producing. I have a Fifth Avenue Jazz and it is really impressive. What is your opinion on Godin? Godin is in Quebec, Canada. Bang for buck, they make some really fine guitars and a number of different brands, including Seagull being one of their better known acoustic brands. They are fine quality instruments for the price. They range from student models on up to things that are certainly suitable for professional use. I don't feel that they're going to give Martin or Gibson serious competition on the high end, but bang for a buck. If you want a guitar for $400 or $500 and some of their models on up over $1,000 in their price bracket, they're among the best available. They're good instruments for what you're paying for, and they're very playable. Jeffrey Bullock says, I have a 1974 Martin D16H. I think it is far better than the later D16T technology series. I think it has a dovetail attachment and forward bracing. I also don't see a lot of these around. Any idea how many were made? First, I don't have any record of a D16H from that time. There was a D16H model made 91 to 96. The technology series Martins with a bolt-on neck and a special modified bracing pattern came out in 96. But in the period of the 80s, around 87, Martin made a D16M in mahogany back and sides, a D16A with ash back and sides, and a D16W with walnut back and sides, and that has bracing very much like what you have described, dovetail neck joint, forward shifted scallop bracing. They were very good guitars. In fact, far better, in my opinion, than the technology series that followed. And in many ways, these style 16s for the D16M, A, and W, I think were better sounding guitars than a brand new D18 was at that time, because the new D18 in 87 did not have forward shifted scallop bracing. So those are good, but something's not adding up about the 1974 D16H, because 74 was before Martin even introduced the HD28, which didn't come out till 76. So something's wrong in the dates and you need to check the serial number of your guitar. If you wish, you can send me photos and serial number to george@guitars.com and I will respond. Kevin Gore asks about my thoughts on what Taylor is doing with the V-brace, and I think that's a question I answered previously, but I'll still say that the V-brace from Taylor is something that works quite well. They can open and close the configuration of the V so far as how you do it this way. You can open and close it, and this way will be a tighter sound. This way will be a more open sound. If you want to play bluegrass, the more open type sound would be good, but most of what Taylor is doing is braced so that it will sound extremely good with their pickup system. And if it's too lively acoustic, too wide open, then they will have difficulty being able to control feedback, so that they typically are braced where they have that good acoustic sound and good optimum electric acoustic sound. But the V-brace has been very successful for Taylor, and it does show that yes, there's more than one way that one can brace a guitar. In general, if you have the right mass of top to bracing, the right ratio, you can get a good sound with a variety of different bracing patterns. But Taylor put a great deal of thought into what they did. Andy Powers, their chief designer, is a very knowledgeable individual, knows more about construction of guitars than the vast majority of designers I've ever met. And I think highly of his talents. I still am a big fan of Martin X bracing. The Gruhn model Martins that we sell large quantities of as custom shop instruments. Have done well for us. And I still like the sound of traditional X, but I also happen to think that the new Taylor V bracing is a very valid, good pattern. And for many players, seems to suit them ideally well. And two different flavors. It's like comparing vanilla and chocolate, deciding which is better. And the answer is they're different, but not necessarily one replaces the other. I've had another question about how do I feel about torified tops used today by builders compared to the sound of vintage instruments. And I've said it before, I'll say it once more quickly. Torified wood to my ears does not sound the same as naturally aged, good quality wood. And the harmonic response of the naturally aged spruce to my ear is richer. And if you simply measure it, you can graph it. It is not simply subjective, it's measurable. The harmonic response is more complex, more varied, high above the fundamental and below the fundamental note. Every note has a fundamental frequency, and then above and below it, there are harmonic frequencies. And there's a richer grouping of harmonics on the non-torified wood. I prefer naturally aged or non-torified wood. It's Dave Williams. In 2018, I bought from Gruhn Guitars a new Martin Custom Shop Quadruplo 18 S 12 fret Sunburst sinker. It's a wonderful instrument. I love it, intend to keep it for a long time. Will a guitar like this continue to increase in value, or will there be an initial dip in value and then increase over time? Well, one, if you buy any new guitar, new with warranty, and you want to resell it later, it's not going to be new with warranty, and the warranty is not transferable to another owner. So in all probability, as long as the new ones continue to be available, the value of a used one will be a bit less than a dealer can get for a brand new one with warranty. However, in the case of the sinker mahogany, I don't anticipate this wood being available for many more years into the future, because this is wood that was from trees cut between 1880 and 1920 in Belize in Central America, and then floated down the river to the sawmill, and then processed. They lose about 30%. And the trees have been underwater ever since, because at that time when the tree was cut, they didn't have sonar to find it or scuba gear to go after it, but now they do, and it's economically practical now to go after it. But as long as the material continues to be available, the value of the guitar may not go up dramatically. However, prices go up over time. We do have inflation. These things will hold their value quite well, because, in my opinion, these are some of the finest new guitars I have ever heard. And I expect them to hold their value quite well and have a good potential to go up over time. But I wouldn't hold my breath waiting it to go up within the coming year or two. Robert Smith. I have a 2012 Martin D28 Sunburst, a Martin 0018 GE 37 bracing pattern in 2007, and a near mint 1960 Gibson L48. I would appreciate any info/opinions you could share. And again, for questions like that, it's so broad in general, I can't cover them in detail in this sort of conversation, although you can send me an email to george@guitars.com. The 0018 GE Golden Era is a model no longer being produced. Has an Adirondack spruce top with forward shifted scallop bracing, made in 2007, but they don't make them anymore. And that's a guitar that I feel has gone up in value. That's a good guitar. And I think that bracing pattern and the fact that it has an Adirondack non-torified top makes that a real gem of sorts in terms of modern guitars that I think are worth more now than they were a few years ago. The 2012 Martin D28 Sunburst is not especially collectible, but it's a plenty good guitar. Guitar of that sort is absolutely suitable for professional use on stage or in the studio. The 1960 Gibson L48 is a guitar with a pressed mahogany arched top and was the least expensive student model Gibson archtop acoustic guitar at that time, but it still was well made. It's comfortable to play. And if you put a floating pickup on it, the fingerboard's not raised off the top, so there's not a whole lot of room to fit a pickup exactly where you'd like it, although you can slide it back a bit and still get a pretty good sound. It's not going to, you can't slide the pickup up right at the end of the fingerboard because there's not enough room for it. But you can put, well, Fishman and others make pickups built into bridge saddles, and those will work fine on it. And it will record well, and certainly has a comfortable neck. It's a well-made guitar, not fancy, but well-made. Scott Shapiro, if you were going to buy a Telecaster and wanted something as close to an original Blackguard in terms of sound, what more affordable era would you look for? Or would you consider Custom Shop or one of the Cornetto guitars from the 1990s? Well, actually, the brand new Custom Shop Fender guitars are quite good. And if you get one of the Custom Shop models, they make some remarkably good replicas, such that the brand new ones sound better than the Fenders of 50 years ago. But keeping in mind 50 years ago was 1970, which was hardly their golden era. But even the late 60s guitars from Fender are not as good, in my opinion, in sound or playability as the new Fenders. And it doesn't have to be strictly Custom Shop to be pretty darn good out of Fender. Their new guitars are good, but their Custom Shop guitars certainly are absolutely stage worthy. And their master builds, sure enough, are. But you can get fine playability without having to spend the money for a new master build. Fender guitars are good quality. There are other makers doing clones that also are good. There's dozens of people doing that. So bang for buck, you can get a good new Telly clone. John Hatton, please comment on the gold Indian head decals that are found on early Lion and Healy, Oahu, Larson, K-Craft, etc. instruments. Is the decal real gold? If so, on severely damaged instruments, what is the best way to get this gold off? Well, there is no gold, true metallic, real gold to be retrieved from those decals. So they may be gold color, but they ain't gold. Ron Williams, I know you usually like to play acoustic music such as Carter Family on your L10 and L5 guitars. If you decided to be a rocker and played electric guitar, what style rock/blues genres would you play, and what instruments would you choose to own? Well, at 74 and a half, I'm probably not going to become a rocker, but there certainly is rock and R&B that I've listened to and still like, particularly R&B. And I knew Mike Bloomfield pretty well, and I remember vividly when I was a student at the University of Chicago, when he was the guitar player for the Paul Butterfield Blues Band, and I thought they were amazing. I was driving home one day and just on WPLN, Public Radio Nashville, they were playing some of Paul Butterfield Band, and wow, it brought back a lot of great memories. And if I were going to be an electric player, that's some of the stuff I'd really enjoy doing. And to me, the right guitar, if I have to pick an electric, the sound of a good 52 or 3 Blackguard Telly, get the right one of those, they're magic. And the Les Paul guitars with PAF humbuckers from mid-57 right through 1960 are also magic. And if I had my choice of electric guitars to play, that's what I'd play. But the fact is, the reality is I'm not an electric guitar player. But if I were, that's what I'd go for. Also, interestingly, the tonal signature, the harmonic response, just the character of tones were really, really good. 52 or 3 Telly is remarkably acoustic sounding. Obviously, you can crank more volume out, you can do things an acoustic won't do, but the general tonal character is remarkably similar to a good acoustic. From David Collins, there are a few luthiers who are taking old Silvertone, Harmony, K, and Regal guitars and rebuilding them with Martin-style X bracing, upgraded tuners, upgraded nut and saddle. What are your thoughts on these guitars? Are they primarily for studio or personal use versus collectability? Well, they're certainly not collectible. And frankly, I don't think that they're a particularly good deal at all. These guitars were built with very cheap wood, not prime spruce, and typically birch or other pretty cheap wood for the back sides and neck. To get them to really play well, you'd have to put a truss rod in the neck, rebracing it, reconstructing it. By the time you end up with that, you're going to spend more labor, more time, more money than if you simply bought something like, if you get a new DSS 17 Martin, which we sell for $1,560, they sound great. I'd much rather have one of them than any of the conversions I've heard. And there are others such as Beard and Collings, Collings Waterloo models, and Beard in Maryland is making some guitars that are well made. You can get ladder bracing or X bracing, better quality wood than if you were to convert any of these earlier guitars. Rather than converting what was essentially a cheap guitar, often with a shorter than standard scale, and a rather small body, you can get things made that are eminently playable with a good adjustable neck, much better quality wood, better construction, and for no more money. And I see no reason to try to do the conversions. If you don't do it well, then it isn't a great instrument. If you really do it well, you put so much labor into it that you could just as well have made a new guitar and it would have been better. Mike Peterson, what acoustic guitar characteristics distinguish them as entry-level, intermediate level, or professional level? Well, in some cases, that's a rather fuzzy explanation because, for example, I just mentioned the DSS 17 Martin, and they also made the 00 and 000 size of the style 17s recently with spruce top and mahogany back and sides and scallop bracing. And they're remarkably good guitars. And you can definitely play them professionally. They may not look fancy, but there's nothing about them that is not playable. I actually enjoy playing one of those, although I enjoy some of the Sinker mahogany ones with the Adirondack spruce top better. I'd have to say that the Style 17 Martins are quite remarkable, and for some types of music, especially blues, they're some of the best guitars I've ever played for that. And usually entry level is not made in the USA anymore. It used to be back in the 50s and 60s. Harmony and K and Regal made entry level guitars, but entry level guitars now are typically Mexican, Indonesian, Chinese, Vietnamese, not Japanese anymore, because labor in Japan costs as much as in the US, and everything else over there costs more. Materials, fuel, transportation, wood, anything else you want to name, it costs more in Japan than it does here, and labor costs about the same. But professional level instruments these days have about the same neck contour that intermediate or student models do. If you're doing it on a CNC machine, it's the same amount of labor to make a nice neck contour as it is a rather crude one. But the professional quality instruments certainly have higher grade wood. Good quality spruce, good quality rosewood, and even high grade mahogany is expensive. So that's one thing that sets the student model aside from the intermediate model, which may have mahogany, but it's probably not going to be solid construction rosewood. It might be laminated. And the professional grade will be solid construction throughout, no laminations, and higher grade wood, more expensive, old growth wood, lacquer versus poly finish. Almost all student grade instruments are not lacquer, and actually most intermediate are not either. And professional grade will either be lacquer or French polish or varnish, or in some cases poly, but done very, very thin. So we now have processes where we can spray a poly finish extremely thin, such that the acoustic properties there are good. A thick poly finish is basically coating a guitar in a thick plastic blanket. That's not good acoustically. But some of the new techniques of spraying an incredibly thin poly finish do give a sound that I would have to admit can be used on a good professional grade instrument, but my personal preference still is for French polish or lacquer. And obviously fancy ornamentation is something affordable on professional instruments, whereas beautiful pearl inlay or engraving, whatever, is not going to be on an intermediate or student model, but ornamentation is not what makes an instrument great. So you can have a very plain instrument, just like a Stradivari or a Guarneri violin, doesn't have much ornamentation. The original Gibson Lloyd Loar signed L5 guitar or F5 mandolin was not very fancy looking, but they were very, very well made with extremely fine materials. But these days you can get even a student grade instrument with CNC workmanship where the neck is comfortable, the intonation is good, but you don't get the same materials, and there's a certain sophistication of sound that comes with the best of materials. Steve Chrysophylle, did Martin use Sitka or Adirondack spruce for bracing on guitars built in the 30s with Adirondack tops? And the evidence seems to be that on most, if not all of those, that they actually did have Sitka bracing on an Adirondack top. But I think going back early enough, you're going to find Adirondack, but there is on the bracing as well. So it's a matter of what year. Martin changed specs over the years, but Martin records do show that in the 30s there was evidence that they were ordering Sitka spruce for bracing. Steve McLaughlin, what years are considered golden era for Dobros? Some very fine Dobros are being manufactured today. Are we living in the golden era now for this instrument? First, we could say that the name Dobro is a registered trade name. That name is currently owned by Gibson, but people still call it Dobro generically, and nobody seems to be getting sued over that these days. It's just like Kleenex, well, it's a brand name, but people still for a long time just referred to Kleenex, whatever. So some brand names become so generic. But for true Dobro brand, pre-World War II, particularly late 20s through mid 30s, when they were actually made in California rather than in Chicago, when they were made under license by Regal. The Regal-made Dobros in general do not bring as much money as the California-made Dobros. But very few people today are using a Dobro brand on stage. Almost all of them now are using new guitars by makers such as Paul Beard in Hagerstown, Maryland. Jerry Douglas endorses Beard along with numerous other great players, and they are extremely fine instruments. In fact, they may be some of the finest ever made. Shearhorn is another one that was doing great work, but he's retired from building, although there are still Shearhorn brand made under license by National Resophonic. And for metal body guitars, National Resophonic today builds great ones. And the pre-World War II, from 1927 up through the start of World War II, made by National, are great instruments, but their necks were not as good as what National Resophonic makes today. The early National and early Dobro brand, on their round neck guitars, did not have adjustable truss rods, and often enough they warp. But the brand new ones today, if they're round neck, will have an adjustable rod, and they tend to intonate and physically play better than the pre-World War II. So it's one of the few examples where the pre-World War II golden era for Martin or Gibson may not be the golden era for resonator guitars. Golden era for resonator guitars might very well be right now. Tom Van Tilburg, I'm wondering about the proper tuning of a 12-string guitar. Do you start with 440 tuning on the heavy gauge strings, and then for lighter gauge bottom 4 strings, do you tune them 1 octave higher than the top 2? Well, basically on a 12-string guitar, many players don't use a 440. They'll, like Leadbelly, played at least 3 frets low. And the pre-World War II 12-string guitars made by companies such as Oscar Schmidt, the Stella brand, if they were tuned to full A440 pitch for the standard 6, the guitar would fall apart. And the guitar Stella, the one that Leadbelly played, also had a long scale. It was certainly made for low tuning. Guild and Martin were among the first to do 12-string guitars in the 1960s that they specified were designed to be tuned to A440. And on a 12-string, the B and the high E have 2 paired. Those are paired strings, and they're paired. They're unison tuned. And for the 4 strings, the lower strings, the E, A, D, and G, the standard thickness string is tuned to regular standard guitar tuning, and the smaller string accompanying it is tuned 1 octave higher. But not everybody plays a 12-string tuned up to full A440. So, but that's the basic answer to your question. Same person, my understanding of Gibson guitars is that their quality really went down in the late 1960s, 70s, and 80s. When did their quality improve? Additionally, did the quality go down on guitars coming out of their custom shop as well? My concern would be about the Gibson L5. If I were in the market to purchase an L5 to perform with, what year should I consider, or what years should I just stay away from? Well, in general, late 60s through the 70s are some of the poorest quality Gibsons ever made, particularly in the acoustics. But also, it's true of the electrics. They're not nearly as good as what was before that, or what they make today. The quality of the custom shop, first it should be noted that in the 70s, there were plenty of guitars that, into the 80s, there were some that had custom shop decal on the back of the peg head, but they really didn't have a true custom shop until 1986. So when you see the 1980s guitars before that have a custom shop decal on the back of the peg head, it was something that was made as a limited run or something special, but it was not truly made in a separate division. It was made on the regular assembly line, and it was not really a true custom shop. And the custom shop over time maintained its quality quite well. And 86 is when Norlin sold Gibson to Henry Juskowitz and his partners, Dave Berryman and Gary Zabrowski. Zabrowski only stayed on for about 9 months or so and left, but Berryman and Juskowitz were at Gibson until the transition to the new ownership, which is a relatively recent thing, but the quality of the custom shop did not have any particular period when it just took a nosedive. It has been pretty well on an upward trajectory over time. As they learn more and stay at it, their quality has been good. Right now, of course, the factory in Nashville is still shut down, but presumably they will be open again soon. And we'll just have to see how things go from here. COVID-19 has a whole new era developing. We'll see what happens. But if you were to purchase an L5 to perform with, what years should you consider or stay away from? I guess to some extent that may depend on your budget, because the L5 never really did go down in quality so badly as to not be worthy of consideration by a professional player. Plus, you haven't really said whether you want an electric L5 or an acoustic L5. But even from the 70s, a good L5 electric is probably going to cost at least $6,000 for one in good condition. And it's still a good guitar. Is it as good as the one from the early 60s or the 50s? No. But it's still plenty good enough to take on stage and use professionally. There's not any year for the L5 that I'd simply say stay away from it entirely. The ones I'd perhaps be afraid of a bit would be 1994, when they experimented with a double action truss rod, and many of those rods went bad and just don't work. So if there's a particular year to be wary of with some of the Gibson models, it would be especially that period when they were using a double action truss rod, particularly on their acoustic instruments. For Joe Wilcox, I've noticed that on some guitars that where the neck attaches to the body, that the string spacing from the neck edge to the 6th bass string varies from the string spacing for the neck edge to the high E string. Is this typical? Especially on electric guitars, people bend notes a lot. And they're likely to want a little bit more room on that treble side than on the low bass, where they're not going to bend notes. But that low E string is just less flexible than the high E string. So you may need a little bit more spacing, but different makers have their own theory on that. And it shouldn't vary just wildly, but having a bit more space for the high E is quite acceptable. But we would like to see at least that the string spacing between each pair of strings is relatively consistent, or extremely consistent. For onward, Tom Maggio. I think Jack Pearson of Nashville is one of the most versatile and talented guitarists I've ever heard. Do you know Jack? And if so, what do you think? Well, yes, I know Jack. I think he's great. And I can also tell you that he's one of Vince Gill's favorite guitar players. And Vince is sure enough great. Vince has great respect for Jack. Jack is a very versatile player. Nashville is filled with a lot of really great players, but Jack certainly is one of the ones that I think has real soul and personality to his playing. But I'd have to say we've got dozens of really fine guitar players in Nashville, just great guitar players per square mile. Nashville may be one of the best places on planet Earth for that, which is one reason why Gruhn Guitars is here. I'm not native to Nashville. I moved to Nashville specifically to open up a music store, and I don't have any intention of moving out of this town. Mike Scarvellis. I have a habit of picking up guitars off the scrap heap. I have a 1957 L5CN that was damaged in an accident that someone cut a hole in the top and added a Charlie Christian pickup. Would it benefit the value of the instrument to have the top section replaced and have either a P90 or an Alnico staple pickup installed? Well, obviously, if this guitar has been highly reworked, you're not going to greatly reduce its value if you have a really fine professional job done of either a replacement top or splicing wood in, especially if it's a dark finish. You can hide all sorts of ills, but I wouldn't modify a clean original one. But when you have something that's already severely damaged or modified dramatically, changing it around to suit you better, no problem. Do it to it. But if you're going to go to the trouble of doing it, do it right. Have somebody who knows what they're doing do the job so that it will be of good professional quality and perform very well. Nick Antonicelli. I have an early 30s Epiphone Broadway Masterbuilt with a bowed neck and no truss rod. I want to get it up to playable condition, but also do not want to hurt the instrument's value. Would you advise heat treatment to straighten the neck in the hands of a qualified luthier, or is there a better way to get it in playing condition without hurting its value too much? In general, heat treating necks really is not a long-term solution. Usually, after a few months of string tension, it's going to warp again. And usually, if the neck is severely warped, you would be better off to have a truly competent luthier remove the fingerboard carefully, put in reinforcement, either a steel rod or you can put in graphite, which will stiffen it, and re-glue the board. The work can be done by a really skilled pro so that it will be invisible and the instrument will still be absolutely functional. But if the neck is warped severely, it's not likely to get the desired result by heat treating, or at least not a result that is going to last very long. I don't typically advocate dramatically doing customization on old instruments, but there are just times when, to be playable, one has to be realistic that things need work and maintenance to be playable. And sometimes the original design was actually less than perfect. In the early 30s, Gibson still had a patent protection on the adjustable rod. But later, Epiphone and others were able to put rods, adjustable rods, in the necks. D'Angelico and Martin put in steel non-adjustable reinforcement early on. Martin started that in late 1934. And certainly something like that can be done, or as I said, the graphite would be lighter weight and you could still get great structural stability if it's done right. But this requires real skill to do it without messing up the neck severely. If you want the cosmetics to be good and the ultimate result for playability to be optimum, this is a job for a skilled pro. This is not an amateur job, but that is what I would recommend. I had several questions about Fender hollow body Tellys of the late 60s. And this is, I have a picture right here I can show you. Starting in 1967, Fender did a few, sometimes now are called the smuggler Telly. There's, you can see 3 cavities. And this was an attempt to reduce weight with the pick guard on. It looks exactly like a standard Telecaster. And so far as sound, the difference is minimal. But Fender was using some very heavy wood. It used to be, they were using lighter weight ash. When you get into the late 60s and into the 70s, some of that wood just feels like it filled the guitar with lead. They're so heavy. The same species of tree, depending on growing conditions, how fast it grew or how much mineral content was in the soil, you can have as much as 50% variation in cubic weight. So a cubic foot of ash from one location might weigh twice as much almost as another, at least 50% difference. So this was an attempt to reduce weight. And by 68, they decided that maybe it would make more sense to just make a hollow body Telly, which they did, and it had F-hole, 1 F-hole. But in 67, this so-called, it's called a smuggler model, because it said you could stash things in there, and you could probably go through customs or whatever, and put your dope stash there or whatever, but that wouldn't work very well today. Notice if you go to the airport now, they got dogs to sniff at the customs area, and even for just routine checkup, even if you're not going through customs, and everything goes through an X-ray. And so the term smuggler's Telly is just not very applicable anymore. Onward. Alan Burton, you have had an amazingly successful career and influenced and inspired many people in the music business. Knowing what you know now, what, if anything, would you have done differently to improve your career and business life? Well, I can tell you that while I certainly have grown the business over the years, and having survived 50 plus years in business, 50 and 1/2 at this point, and still surviving the COVID-19 crisis, and staying open and staying still profitable, I can look back and say how much more profitable and probably how much more relaxed my life would have been if I had taken a few business administration courses in college, or at least had the good sense to hire competent, honest bookkeepers early on in my career. Because when it comes down to business management, you can know an awful lot about guitars. And if you don't manage things properly, you really can make some poor decisions and greatly decrease profitability. You know, there may not be a lot of glamour involved in looking at spreadsheets or studying all the different types of health insurance and other benefit packages. But when it comes down to good employee relations, happy workplace, and a profitable business, it helps to either have employees or a partner who does that. And there are companies such as, for example, Taylor. Bob Taylor and Kurt Listig are an amazing pair. Kurt handles the business end. Bob handled the design and production. And the two of them had talents that complemented each other. And it's only quite recently in my business, with my stepson Urich as business manager and company president, that I have anything like that. Plus, we have a very excellent bookkeeper as well. But if I had to do it over again, knowing what I know now, that would be the change. And I think we'd be all the stronger for it. But it's never too late to start that. And so I'm pleased to say that Gruhn Guitars is better managed today than it's ever been before in the history of the company, which is one reason why, even in the midst of the coronavirus pandemic, we are still functioning smoothly and profitably, and I'm still enjoying what I do. It's hard to enjoy what you do if you're unprofitable and struggling to pay the bills. Martin Walters, Louisville, Kentucky. Is there anything to the notion that Gibson in the late 90s to 2000 was a particularly good wood era for Gibson Electrics? Many thanks. And my answer to that is, to the best of my knowledge, no, there's nothing special about being better wood in that period than today. Some of the best wood Gibson ever had might very well have been pre-World War II, but so far as I'm having had better wood from the late 90s to 2000, I see no particular evidence of that. Same person, another question, what is the difference in tone one can expect from Martin 0028 versus a 0018? Does the mahogany on the 0018 give it a slightly brighter tone? Well, there is a notable difference in tone between a rosewood back and side guitar and a mahogany guitar, and also notable difference if it has maple back and sides. You can make a fine guitar with any of those three woods with the same type spruce top, but there are also other alternative woods that are good. But in general, maple is a very bright tone. Mahogany has a bright but somewhat mid-rangey tone, and the rosewood has a really rich, mellow, and somewhat bass-oriented tone. You can build a great guitar with either one. And it is, to a certain extent, a matter of personal preference. A lot of recording studio artists find that mahogany is one of the easiest to work with in the studio, as far as balancing it for a recording. But you can get supremely good sound with any one of those three woods. Martin did not make much in flat top guitars with maple. A few, but very few. Mostly mahogany and rosewood, Brazilian rosewood prior to 1970, and Indian rosewood primarily since then. But the 0018 will be a brighter and more mid-rangey sound in general than the 0028. And that's the same basic generalization, though, can be said for whatever maker it is. Mahogany, maple, and rosewood for the back and sides do produce a different tonal result, but you can get good sound either way. Martin Pessar, I'm among those who feel that we are currently in the midst of a golden age of Luthery, with many builders producing great guitars. In addition, Martin continues to make superior guitars, particularly via their custom shop. I'm thinking of people like Wayne Henderson, Tony Clausen, Dale Fairbanks, and many more. Do you agree with this assessment? How do you compare these fine instruments to those built in the 1930s by Martin? You expect that these small shop guitars will become collectible and increase in value over the next decades. And we sort of touched on that in the past. Yes, this is a golden age in terms of the number of luthiers building fine quality guitars suitable for professional use on stage or in the studio is probably more now than ever before in the history of the instrument. Are they producing instruments that I feel are better than 1930s Martin and Gibson flat tops? In general, no. But in general, maybe the real term here, because when it comes right down to it, these makers are not all equal. And some of them are supremely good and get a lot of money for their guitars. There are some builders getting $20,000 plus for a new flat top guitar with hardly any ornamentation, and on up for more if it has fancy flumadiddle ornamentation. So how much they'll increase in value in the future, quite frankly, depends on what quality guitars are going to be available in the future. Will we have good wood? It's going to be harder to get good wood. Will there be people who are highly skilled? As long as there's a demand from people who are willing to pay the price, which will provide an incentive for people to do this type work, then it's going to be available. And where it's going to go from here, I don't know. And at age 74, I'm not going to be here 50 years from now in all probability to view that. But I would predict that many guitars made today will be somewhat collectible in the future, if only because the type of wood they're built out of is not going to be available anymore. But the fact is, there's still going to be some good wood available. And for a small-time builder who's building, say, one guitar a month, even 50 years from now, there's going to be some really good wood that they can get for the right price. And if they have high level of skill, human ingenuity is not disappearing. People are not becoming stupider than those of the past. And we learn from our predecessors. There was a period in the 50s and 60s when the old apprentice system had broken down and hand skills were almost disappearing. That's no longer the case. So there'll still be good guitars in the future. We have Holly Stinger. He's mentioned the importance of choosing the right strings and how different strings and gauges can change the sound and feel of a guitar. Well, dead strings don't sound as good as nice, bright new ones, and different brand strings are notably different. In general, small guitars shouldn't have anything in acoustic more than light gauge on them, but dreadnought-sized guitars typically sound best with mediums. And there are numerous brands. I'm not going to try to pick one versus the other. You're going to need to see what works for you. Some people like monosteel wrapping. Some people like bronze wrapping. The bronze alloys vary. And what sounds great on one guitar is not necessarily going to sound equally great on another. So Martins and Gibsons and Collings, for example, react differently from each other. And you're going to have to experiment a bit. George Scanelli, what are George's thoughts regarding collecting vintage cowboy guitars manufactured in the 1920s through 1950s? They are obviously not expensive guitars. They're majority made by Supertone, later Silvertone. I know both names under the Harmony Company. Well, in general, I view those as decorative wall hangers. And, you know, it's like stamp collecting, coin collecting. They don't have to have a lot of utility, but do I want those guitars to play? No. Some are definitely sought after by memorabilia collectors. I don't see them going up dramatically in price. They're not something I would recommend for a serious player, but they're fun collectibles. John Chamberlain, I once read that foreign collectors of vintage American-made guitars were driving the prices up, particularly Japanese collectors. Do you think this is still the case today? My one-word answer is no. Japanese customers I had who were paying really high prices, much more so than Americans, are, for the most part, no longer active, and a fair number of them are now deceased. If they were much older than me when I was dealing back in the 70s, if they were 40 or 50 years old then, they're likely not to be in the picture today. But in general now, values in the USA are high enough that we're seeing a goodly number of guitars flowing from Japan back to here, things that we sold back in the 70s. In some cases, we're getting them back now, and we're happy to see them, and we have customers for them. Marty Evans, do you feel there's a difference in sound when comparing a solid headstock versus a slotted headstock? The solid peg head has tuner shafts that stick up above the level of the peg head, whereas the slotted peg head has tuners through the peg head such the string angle over the nut is much steeper on the slotted peg head because the string shafts are midway through the peg head, so the strings effectively are recessed halfway into the peg head, and it gives more pressure downward on the nut. It does produce some difference in sound or feel, rather subjective. I happen to like the looks of the solid peg head. They're a little more difficult so far as quick restringing, but I like them personally. And when it comes down to it, we're running short on time, but try to pick one last question here. Let's see, where shall we be for the last one? For many years, you've noted your favorite acoustic guitar is a late 1920s Gibson L5. Finding accomplished acoustic archtop players, whether live or recorded, gets more difficult year after year. Do you have any personal favorites, whether they're well-known or a well-kept secret? Well, I certainly have my favorite guitars because it's old L5s. And so far as personal favorites for guitar players, they don't always have to be current players. You can listen to a lot of fine old recordings and hear just what they were doing. And if you want to hear what can be done on acoustic archtop guitar, certainly Doug Green with Riders in the Sky is a fine acoustic player. But one of his mentors was Andy Reese, was and still is. Andy Reese is a session player in town. He plays with the Time Jumpers Western Swing Band. Andy is a master of getting tone out of an archtop guitar. And what can be done on it is quite amazing. But it's a real art. Freddie Green was the rhythm player for the Count Basie band, and certainly his playing is just quintessentially wonderful. If you're going to talk about electric archtop players, then you get into folks like, just so many of them, but the Johnny Smith was a great player, and the Johnny Smith model Gibson guitar was a fine guitar, but what Johnny himself played early on was D'Angelico guitars, and those were great instruments for his style, but that's not in any way similar to the style, for example, that Freddie Green was playing with Count Basie, which was a chord rhythm. Johnny was playing electric jazz and doing amazing things, but archtop guitars are very versatile. And Maybelle Carter was certainly the one who personally influenced my playing more than anybody else. And one can listen to what she did on an archtop guitar, but also if you listen to recordings, not of country music from Maybelle, but listen to what Eddie Lang did, the father of modern jazz guitar. And he also played on a 16-inch L5. He died in 1933, but the recordings live on. And if you want to hear how it can be, and certainly just hear some phenomenal recordings, you don't have to confine yourself only to who's doing it right now. That's the whole purpose of recording. Those recordings can outlive any person or player. So Eddie died in 1933, but his music ain't dead. Listen to it. And I'll look forward to hearing more from you folks next week. I enjoy doing these sessions and look forward to the next one.